I want to welcome you to the Singing of a New American, Pauli Murray's Legacy and Justice in the 21st Century. This event is part of Howard University's sesquicentennial celebrations and is also the university's Constitution Day event. We are thrilled that all of you are here to help us in commemorating those two occasions. I want to say a few words about how all of this came together and a little bit about what Pauli Murray means to me. When we started to think about how the law school would celebrate the university's sesquicentennial, we quickly decided that a conference would be appropriate, but we needed a topic. We thought of covering law school history and doing a retrospective on some of the greats of Howard University School of Law, like Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, Spottswood Robinson, and many others. But as we talked, my associate dean, Lisa Crooms Robinson, said, you know, we should really think about doing Pauli Murray. And we were talking about lots of different people who we could settle on, but very quickly we decided that this was an appropriate moment to honor Pauli Murray. Lawyer, the first African-American female Episcopal priest, a civil rights advocate, advisor to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and co-founder of the National Organization for Women. So Murray, who is a 1944 graduate of this law school, I encourage you during some part of the day to wander up to the first floor, see her picture in the class mural that is on the wall right there. Her life was being celebrated in lots of ways recently. A wonderful book by Patricia Bell Scott, who you'll hear do the keynote address, a conference on her at Radcliffe. Yale has named a residential college after her. There was a beautiful article about her in the New Yorker, and of course her childhood home in Durham, North Carolina was recently designated as a National Historic Landmark. As her law school, we wanted to make sure that she gets her due from Howard University and from this law school. We have a room named after her upstairs, but we wanted to make sure that this conference, which is obviously being recorded, will be preserved and become a lasting tribute to Pauli's brilliance and her many contributions to making this world a more just place for people from marginalized communities. As the day starts, I just want to thank a few key people. I can't say enough about the work of Associate Dean Lisa Crooms Robinson. She is really the intellectual powerhouse and the soul of this conference. You will hear her presentation later, but she's a true Pauli Murray scholar and a living embodiment of the Murray legacy. I want to thank the law school staff. Shalonda Colbert, my special assistant, has thrown herself into this conference, even sometimes in the face of a lot of personal hurdles that she was conquering. She has really made this conference her own, so I want to thank Shalonda. Even though I don't think she's in the room, she's still working. And of course, I want to thank LaShawn Reeder, my other assistant Jackie Young, who is here in the room, Tiffany Harris, and Assistant Dean Anne Marie Waterman for all they've done to put this together. I also want to acknowledge, we'll have members of Pauli Murray's family will be here later. I don't think any of them are in the room right now, but Rosita Stevens-Holsey, she is. Rosita, oh, there you are. Please stand up. Brenda Coakley, and any other members of the Murray family, please stand if you're here. Okay. For me personally, Pauli Murray has become one of my personal heroes and role models. I walk by her class mural picture every morning as I go to my office, and I just glance to the right, and seeing her face gives me inspiration and strength for the day to come. I didn't know a lot about Dr. Murray until I came here as dean in 2014. My interviews for this job were in the Pauli Murray suite, and when I saw her picture on the wall, I immediately went home, went back to the hotel, and Googled her to see who is this person who has a suite named after them in the Howard Law School. And I was astounded by her work as a lawyer, a priest, a writer, and a poet, her vision of what should be possible for women and people of African descent in a time where every door of opportunity was slammed in her face. I read her autobiography, and this year, every 1L here at Howard University School of Law received a copy of her autobiography for them to get that same inspiration. I've reread many of the passages, and I encourage you to read Song in a Weary Throat. So the format of this conference, we will start with a panel, and afterwards our presenters will be speaking in turn with no formal introductions. I encourage you to read their bios in the program. We have an incredibly distinguished group of presenters for today. We will have a keynote this afternoon by Patricia Bell Scott, and then a book signing. And finally, we'll have closing remarks by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. When we started talking about this conference, those were the two names that we said we absolutely had to have, Patricia Bell Scott and Justice Ginsburg, and they're both here today, so we're so thrilled by that. Now I want to bring up my distinguished colleague, Dr. Yolanda Pierce, who is the new dean of the Howard School of Divinity. Dr. Pierce has written about Dr. Pauli Murray, and she is here to bring a welcome and opening remarks. Dr. Pierce.
Priest and poet and prophet. As priests entering at the age of 62, entering into seminary, letting you know that it's never too late if you are interested in pursuing a seminary degree. At the age of 67, ordained into the Episcopal priesthood. Murray's journey into the priesthood, like many, was quite complicated by her complex feelings about Christianity and the church itself. Raised in the church by devout family, all of her life she struggled with the complexities of how gender is articulated in our scripture, in our song, and in our traditions. Pauli Murray writes, quote, I had been taught all my life to revere the church and its teachings, but I could only condemn the church as sinful when it denied me the right to participate fully and freely in the worship of God as my brothers. If the present church gender customs were justified, then I did not belong in the church and it became a stumbling block to my faith, end quote. And so she, along with a group of women, challenged that stumbling block, and in 1977 became the first group of women priests ordained, she becoming the first African-American Episcopal woman priest. When she gave her opening Eucharist communion service, she did so at the Chapel of the Cross. This particular space was so important to Pauli Murray because at this chapel, there was a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. Her grandmother had been born into slavery. But it wasn't only the Bible. There was a lectern at the pulpit, and that lectern was given by the woman, Mary Ruffin-Smith, who had owned her grandmother. And so here, Pauli Murray presides over the Eucharist table with these symbols that are the contradiction of American democracy. Pauli Murray describes it as such. Whatever future ministry I might have as a priest, it was given to me that day to be a symbol of healing. All the strands of my life had come together. Descendant I was of slave and slave owner. I had already been called poet and lawyer and teacher and friend. Now I was empowered to minister the sacrament of one in whom there is no north or south, no male or female, only the spirit of love and reconciliation drawing us toward the goal of human wholeness. Pauli Murray as poet. Perhaps this is my favorite aspect of the woman that we are honoring today. The poet, the woman who began writing poetry as a child, as a teenager, and continued all of her life. Many of you are familiar, perhaps you are, with her collections of poetry that are in her autobiography, but she also wrote a beautiful work of poetry called Dark Testament and Other Poems. These poems considered American lynching. These poems talked about these crushed hopes and dreams of African American people. But her poem, for which she is most famous, is a poem about hope. She writes, "Hope is a crushed stalk between clenched fingers. Hope is a bird's wing broken by a stone. Hope is a word in a tuneless ditty, a word whispered with the wind, a dream of 40 acres and a mule, a cabin of one's own and a moment to rest, a name and a place for one's children and children's children at last. Hope is a song in a weary throat. Give me a song of hope and a world where I can sing it. Give me a song of faith and a people to believe in it. Give me a song of kindness and a country where I can live it. Give me a song of hope and love and a brown girl's heart to hear it." In this poem, we hear both the lifetime of disappointment and frustration, no 40 acres and a mule, no cabin of one's own, no moment to rest, and yet hope, hope in a weary throat. Pauli Murray as a prophet. Those of us who work in religious studies and theology take the notion of the prophetic quite seriously. And so here I must tell you that when I call Murray a prophet, I'm using the definition that Martin Buber provides us, which is that the task of the prophet is not to predict the future, but it is to confront humankind with the alternatives of their decisions. This is what Pauli Murray did throughout her entire life, her civil rights activism, her work in law, her poetry, her priesthood. She challenged and she confronted. She offered hope to those who were hopeless. Her activism, her legal career, her priesthood, driven by a lifetime of vocation. A vocation, which is a calling, a driving, an urge to do something, to be something beyond, more, bigger. And that is who she was. And so I welcome you on behalf of the School of Divinity to this conference in connection with my colleague, the Dean of the Law School, and encourage us to remember what it means to have hope, to remind us that weary throats can sing, weary throats can whisper, but they can still be heard, and weary throats must continue to speak, even if their voices shake. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Good morning. My name is Chuck Winder, and I'm the Program Staff Officer for Social Justice and Advocacy Engagement on the presiding bishop staff for the Episcopal Church. And as someone who's also a licensed lawyer, even though I don't practice currently, and also someone who attended University of Michigan Law School while your Associate Dean, Lisa Crooms Robinson, was present, I'm filled with joy to be present, to listen to the speakers, but also particularly given my vocation now, to introduce to you a set of panelists that will bring the witness of the Episcopal Church with regard to the legacy of Pauli Murray in the church. And so I'm full of joy, and I'm excited if you could join me in welcoming Bishop Barbara Harris. Bishop Harris is the retired suffragan bishop for the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, and also, perhaps even more significant and important for all of us, the first woman bishop to be ordained and consecrated and elected bishop in the Episcopal Church. But beyond that, and including that, the first woman bishop to be elected and consecrated and serve in the entire Anglican Communion. join me in welcoming also a good friend of Bishop Harris's and a professor of mine and so many others committed to social justice in the Episcopal Church, Dr. Frederica Harris Thompson, Professor Emerita in Historical Theology at the Episcopal Divinity School, and equally important in her current vocation as she's living that out, a strong lay member and leader on the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church, Professor Thompson. And last but not least, equally important to provide witness in Pauli Murray's local context, the Reverend Dr. Brooks Gravener, rector at St. Matthew's in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and also since year 2007, historiographer for the diocese, Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, and since 2009, one of the founding members of the Pauli Murray Project. Please join me in welcoming Brooks Gravener. And now I turn it over to those voices that will bring witness of Pauli Murray's importance in the Episcopal Church and in the theological community. Professor Thompson.
Thank you, Chuck. Good to be here. I want to clarify a term that is used in the description. As far as I know, most lawyers are not saints. Now, you may want to argue that a little bit. But sainthood in the Episcopal Church is a witness category, not necessarily an intercessor, though you might want to pray to Pauli occasionally. But she is there because of the witness she made, because in our family history as a denomination, she shaped that history and leaves a legacy for us that shapes our future so very strongly. So our categories for sainthood are not precisely defined. We use the weasel word comprehensive to define what a saint is. But a saint must have perseverance, faithfulness, locality, a connection to a local mission, and historical witness. So I've asked my friends and colleagues here who have studied Pauli as I have for a number of years to check in on our sainted sister in the communion. And Bishop Harris, would you offer a witness to this witness before us?
Gladly. When I think of Pauli Murray, dates and years come to mind. 1944, the year she graduated law school here, is the year I began my freshman year at the Philadelphia High School for Girls. She was ordained deacon in 1976 at age 66, and a priest in 1977. Of course, she was the first black woman ordained a priest, but she was ordained 3 years after the irregular ordination of a group of women who broke church law, the Philadelphia 11 courageous women who were ordained in my home parish in Philadelphia, and I had the great honor to lead the procession that day. Frederica said, "Did you see Pauli Murray that day?" And I said, "She was there, but out of 2,000 people, no, I did not see her." Anyhow, she was ordained 172 years after the first black priest, Absalom Jones. She served as a deacon 1 year, which is pretty customary nowadays before being ordained priest. Absalom Jones served as a deacon for 10 years before he was ordained priest. Pauli Murray entered General Theological Seminary in 1973 at age 63. Now, In 1975, we both attended a service at Grace Cathedral in Newark, New Jersey. The second part of the service, which we know as coffee hour, she said to me in the middle of the parish hall, "Why aren't you in seminary?" Well, to say I made an incorrect response would be the understatement of the century. I would have been safer waving a red flag in the face of a bull. At age 45, I said, "I'm too old." "Too old," she screamed. And the dressing down that I got in the middle of the floor of that parish hall could be heard even here in Washington, D.C. Well, she dressed me down, or as my elders used to say, she read my title loud and clear to mansions in the sky. But I was not the only one who had heated discussion with her regarding age. Bishop John Melville Burgess, who was the first black bishop of the Diocese of Massachusetts, had hoped perhaps to ordain her. He invited Pauli Murray into the diocesan offices for a conversation. One of the questions he posed to her, in light of the fact that the Episcopal Church had just instituted a mandatory retirement age of 72 and demanded that to be eligible for retirement, you must have served in ordained ministry 10 years. He said to her, "Why do you want to be ordained at your age? You won't get retirement." Well, none of us know what she responded to him, but I can tell you he came out of that meeting visibly shaken to his core, and his hands went up in the air kind of like that. Well, she was ordained a deacon in Massachusetts, but not by Bishop John Burgess, but rather by a predecessor counterpart of mine, Bishop Morris Ben Arnold, who was at that time the bishop suffragan of Massachusetts. Well, I was ordained a deacon in 1979, and in 1980 I was ordained a priest at age 50, and Pauli Murray was present at my ordination. I have a copy of a newspaper photo of Pauli Murray in the center, along with Mary Bunton Adebanejo, the second black woman ordained a priest, and myself as the third black woman ordained a priest. But those are just some of the images and recollections of Pauli Murray that come to mind, and I would simply caution any of you to avoid discussions of age unless they are positive.
Thank you, Barbara. So well beloved, and great stories and more to tell, I'm sure. Brooks, would you chime in from a local base, that locality requirement for the witness of a saint?
Yes. My connection with Pauli Murray is actually parochial. Pauli Murray's family back in the 1870s were members of the parish where I have served for the last 27 years. And her Aunt Pauline, for whom she's named, was baptized at the very same font that we continue to use today. So that's my sort of deep connection with Pauli Murray's story in terms of my own ministry on a daily basis. But it was in 2007 that Pauli Murray became central to my own sense of vocation in the church in a new way. And two things happened in early 2007. One is I was named the historiographer or official historian of our diocese. And at that point in the General Convention, the previous summer in 2006, had called on the Episcopal Church to document and interpret its complicity with slavery. And so, as historiographer of the diocese, it was my job to facilitate that documentation and that interpretation for the church in the central part of North Carolina. And then just a few weeks after I received that charge, I was privileged to be a participant in a 30th anniversary observance of that first service that's already been described at the Chapel of the Cross. Hillsborough, where I serve, is just 10 miles away from Chapel Hill. And in January of 2007, then presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Catherine Jeffords Shorey, came to the Chapel of the Cross and, along with our bishop, Michael Curry, preached and celebrated where Pauli Murray had preached and celebrated 30 years before. And I was privileged to be part of the altar party and to serve with them on that very, very special occasion. That service became the catalyst for our diocese to begin to take the appropriate steps to put forward Pauli Murray's name for canonization, to become a saint of the Episcopal Church. And so we in the Diocese of North Carolina joined with the Diocese of Newark in what is called memorializing General Convention. That is actually sending a formal request that General Convention take up Pauli Murray's name for sainthood. And that was then referred to our Standing Liturgical Commission, and in 2012 that was granted. And so Pauli Murray has been on the calendar of saints of the Episcopal Church since 2012. My own work as historiographer since 2007, for the last 10 years, has been very much shaped by and continued to be supported and sustained and inspired by the witness of Pauli Murray. It has been central to what I have done. It is, we might say, bread for my journey.
Yes.
And there are three particular aspects of Pauli Murray's life and witness that are central to my own understanding. One is her creativity. Pauli Murray, in an essay she wrote about the future of the Episcopal Church, said that there were God's two great gifts to the human race are good health and imagination. And when I think of Pauli Murray, what so continues to inspire me is the creativity with which she looked at the world and the church and continued to resist conformity, to ask difficult questions. The second aspect is something that the dean already talked about, which is the way in which Pauli Murray was willing to address very straightforwardly the complexities and contradictions of our history. She was the great enemy of simplistic bifurcation. And concomitant with that, the great champion of indivisibility. And I'm sure we will be talking about that for the rest of the day. And then the third aspect, which has also been touched on already, are courage and tenacity, which she attributed in her family to the influence of her grandfather. But which she so much embodied in herself, that willingness to stay with a struggle and not look for immediate outcomes, but to be faithful. And these are all three touchstones of Pauli Murray's own life and witness, and they are things to which I aspire.
And things to which we in the Episcopal Church responded by your invitation from North Carolina to proceed with that canonization as a saint in our communion. That insistent persistence.
Yes.
You know, it's breathtaking. And then for a denomination that likes to have lively preaching, strongly, the incredible feistiness and fierceness of her rhetoric at many times. I mean, Barbara and I were reading various passages as we were coming down on the train from Boston, and you turned to me and you said, "She's fierce," you know, and that kind of quality of dedication is there. I love your firebrand, feisty, fierce firebrand language, Professor Bell. That is just extraordinary. It also appears to me that this last first, with which she concludes her vocational exploration, might have been foundational from the very beginning. Could be seen in many of the actions that she'd taken. And she, as she will say later on, she brought that to fulfillment, I think is maybe the word that she uses. So beware, sainthood might come upon you anytime in your life, you know. You might pull those measures together. And one of the qualities of saints as we list them in our understanding of the church as a church historian and theologian is that the message of a saint is to do likewise. You know, go and do likewise from this life. I mean, that is, it seems to me, the central theme of this gathering in which the dean and the deans have invited us to so graciously. What do you think, Barbara? Encouraging us to go forward in terms of Pauli's witness?
I would think that she would encourage all of us to continue our journey with the same steadfastness and courage and dedication which she exhibited. And if any of us could show a quarter of that, we might be considered worthy to stand beside her.
Yeah, incredible. Brooks, anything you want to add into this legacy of justice making that, I mean, this is so important in the narrative that you've drawn for us from North Carolina and other locations in the church?
Well, for those of you familiar with Song in a Weary Throat, you know that the capstone of that book is that service from 1977 at the Chapel of the Cross. And when I think of the significance of that in her own understanding, and I think about it in terms of where we go from here, I think that it is so important to savor and to hold up those moments which do offer glimpses of a kind of reconciliation and justice that is very, very hard to achieve and to sustain. And the last 10 years in which I've been actively involved in this work, I have seen successes, but I've also seen great disappointments.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I appreciate about Pauli Murray's witness is that she helps to, by her own life and witness, to sustain ourselves in the valleys, as well as helping us to celebrate the mountaintop experiences of our life.
Yeah, and that to tie back to that word prophet
Yeah.
that we heard the dean use. You know, prophets who challenge the status quo, and we certainly know Pauli did that, do not necessarily have secure lives, right?
Amen.
Are not necessarily easy people to walk alongside of, are not necessarily ones you want to invite to tea, you know, even though Eleanor did. And so what must look like, the ups and downs of her life are a part of her prophecy,
Yes.
I think, a part of her witness. And those of us in the Episcopal Church and beyond, I've been teaching seminarians for some 40 years, have honored this woman in our dialogue, and we're just extraordinarily delighted that this school has chosen to honor her for this celebration. Thank you so much for doing so, and bless you all. Thank you for being here.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay?
The title of my talk today is Indivisible. And I start with a ritual that marked virtually every single day, Monday through Friday, from September, let's say, through June, from 1968 to 1973. Every morning, we would do the following. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This was common for us every single day. Just as our homework got checked, our hygiene was checked to make sure that we had clean behind our ears and our fingernails were right, and we had a handkerchief. These are the 60s. We would stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I doubt very seriously that my classmates at Edgar Elementary School in Metuchen, New Jersey, really thought twice about it. I actually thought that perhaps it had been written by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. That would explain the reason why we had to say it every morning. Only after I became an adult did I find out that the Pledge of Allegiance was, in fact, penned about 30 years after the end of the Civil War. Changes the notion of what it means to be an indivisible nation. No longer were we talking about the nation of the founders, but this was the nation of Reconstruction. This was the nation of reconciliation. This was the nation to which we pledged our allegiance. But the late 60s, early 70s were also a complicated time. Even though you might not believe it, but to be black in Metuchen, New Jersey was to be woke. We were close enough to Newark, and many of our families had in fact moved to the suburbs from Newark to understand the importance of the work that had been done, not down south, truth be told, but in city centers where our cousins, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles were still struggling, even though some of us had managed to escape and survive out in the suburbs. then black was fairly simple for me, like the annual ritual of picking out a Halloween costume. I had a range of people I could pick from if I wanted to be a black woman, to imagine what my full-grown black womanness would be. I could be Asada, I could be Angela, I could be Diane, that would be Carol, right? Julia. I could be Sonia, I could be Shirley, I could be anybody I wanted to be. So at that point, the prospect of being a black woman was hopeful, simple. Everybody struggling side by side, shoulder to shoulder to get things done. We were unified. Things got a little more complicated later on. When I came to Howard University as a freshman, I was presented with a vision of black liberation that did not seem to line up with what I found to be simple as a child. This was a vision of black liberation that required us to embrace patriarchy, required us to understand that if we were struggling around race, the paradigm around which racial struggle is constructed is black, straight, and male. Being black wasn't going to be so simple. My full-grown black womanhood was not going to be quite so smooth sailing. But when looking for a port in the storm, I found Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray helped all of this make sense. What I thought was the case, that being perhaps my normative vision of how things should be, versus what was really the real deal, that being the positive description of what it means to be black and female in the United States, struggling within the context of securing black liberation on the one hand and struggling for women's liberation on the other hand. It was a heavy lift, but Howard, in fact, clarified a lot of what was to be done. What did Murray help me figure out? With this notion of indivisibility, she demonstrated that by life, by deed, and by theory, that wholeness is where we start. If the whole is kept in mind, we understand that all attempts to splinter us, make us choose, make us not embrace everything that is us are contrary to the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal of liberation of whomever is about creating the space in which human dignity can in fact be protected, respected, and guaranteed regardless of who you are. If for no other reason than you are a human being, this is the dignity to which you are entitled. So, Murray's indivisibility operated on 3 levels, and that's what I'll spend the rest of my time talking about. On a personal level, on a group level, and in this case I'm talking with respect to race, and on a national level. On a personal level, it's quite fitting that we're here at the Howard University School of Law. This isn't the actual building, all right, so don't go home and tell that story. This is not the actual building, but the spirit is here. Howard University School of Law is, as folks have already noted, the place where Murray, as the one woman in her class, was exposed to the theorizing that gave rise to the strategy to strike down Jim Crow. Charles Hamilton Houston treated this as the West Point of the Civil Rights Movement, and his job was to not just crank out lawyers, but crank out theory, to make fundamental changes in what the Constitution meant, to bring the promises found, particularly in the Reconstruction Amendments, that being the 13th, 14th, and 15th, to move them from potential to reality. But imagine you're sitting in class and you hear all of this wonderful discussion about how we're going to be free, but you don't see yourself in the conversation, not your whole self. It's as if you would be expected to strip off the race piece, that was accommodated, but the woman piece, not necessarily. So, I would imagine that she participated in class, but all along she was thinking, I'm going to figure out how to make this work for me. In other words, I'm going to figure out a way to make people like me visible, and I'm going to figure out how to do it using indivisibility. I bring my whole self to the table, and if what I'm working with can't accommodate or respect or even see my whole self, well, then it's the wrong thing, and we must discard that and start anew. Now, with respect to the group piece, the notion that blackness could in fact be defined in terms of what it is that straight, presumably married, black men need or want is confronted by the notion of indivisibility. If a racial group, as it were, is not comprised of one particular sex or gender, it means that race must be expansive enough to speak to the authentic experiences of all of the people in the group, regardless of the particulars of the identity that they bring to the table. So, Murray, having listened very intently and learned her lessons here at Howard University School of Law, decides that we're going to take aim at notions of equality so that not just black men are brought to the table, but black women come as well. Prime example of this effort would be the case of White versus Crook, litigated to challenge the jury system in Lowndes County, Alabama, birthplace of the Black Panther Party. The case originally proceeded as your traditional race case. The plaintiffs were men. The claims were rooted in some combination of the 15th Amendment and the problems with Alabama law. But Murray, along with Dorothy Kenyon, began to press. And they eventually convinced the ACLU that the litigation could not go forward as they had planned, but rather it would proceed in two parts. The first part would challenge the exclusion of black men from the voter rolls and jury service as a violation of Alabama law. The second part would proceed to challenge the exclusion of all women from not the voter rolls, but jury service by law in Alabama. It took a little while for her to convince them, but as you've heard, she was not to be messed with, nor denied. So eventually, the ACLU team relented. She and Dorothy Kenyon are in fact listed as part of the team that successfully litigated this case. And White v. Crook may in fact be one of the only cases where race and sex discrimination are simultaneously pursued as the basis for claims, and it succeeds. The reason why you've never heard about the case, perhaps, being a bit conspiratorial, is that Alabama lost and had no interest in the likelihood that it would, in fact, be upheld upon appeal. So they figured, we'll just let this die. Now, turning to indivisibility in the nation. As I noted earlier, the Pledge of Allegiance is about 30 years younger than the end of the Civil War. We know that at the end of the Civil War, the Constitution was ratified. It was ratified in a way that was designed to move individuals who had previously been defined by law as property, first from property to persons, and then from persons to citizens. That is the point of the 13th, 14th, well, the 13th and the 14th Amendments. We'll leave it at that. Murray's brilliance and what she brought to the table with respect to the notion of Jane Crow speaks to the 14th Amendment. That is, she concludes that if equality and due process under the 14th Amendment requires racial discrimination to in fact be addressed, then racial discrimination can be described not just by Jim Crow, but also by Jane Crow. But imagine this. Imagine if we start not with the 14th Amendment, but with the 13th Amendment. Imagine if the badges and incidents of slavery, not really defined, quite honestly, until you get to Jones versus Alfred H. Mayer, which is in the 1960s. If I'm being a bit more generous, perhaps around the decision that gave rise to the civil rights cases. But if we take this notion of gendering and we gender personhood before we gender citizenship, what happens with respect to the badges and incidents of slavery? We begin to see that if slavery and emancipation or abolition are in fact opposites, then all of the things that were essential to not just defining enslavement, but experiences of enslaved people, all of those things must in fact be addressed and reversed in order for us to talk about what it means to be free, what it means to be fully people, personhood under the 13th Amendment. Now, if that's the case, then incidents in the life of a slave girl, for example, let us know that there were particularly gendered ways that women and girls of African descent experienced slavery, which means that in order to fully reverse that, we must, in fact, address those particularities. Example would be everything that gets bundled into reproductive justice. Control over your bodily integrity, control with respect to choices as to whether you want to have sex, let alone reproduce. Those things should be essential to reversing enslavement. So, if we start that there, and if you accept my premise for the purposes of the conversation, then when we get to the 14th Amendment, the notion of personhood on which the 14th Amendment is based is no longer based upon white supremacy's norm of either white men or white women. It's not that there's no room for, let's say, advancing the rights of white women, for example, under the 14th Amendment. All I contend is that with this change, the gendering of personhood, the claim by white women under the 14th Amendment is one of race. Because the paradigm of full personhood is represented by black women. There we get rid of the need for intermediate scrutiny. There we get rid of the need to parse it in terms of it's not quite like race. No, and it's quite consistent with the framers' intent of the Reconstruction Amendments. There's a racial specificity to those amendments that is maintained if we step back just one amendment. Not start with 14, but start with 13. This, I think, might be something that, at the very least, I'd like to imagine Murray would be willing to talk about. She might not necessarily agree. She might appreciate the thought, but she'd at least be open to the idea that the wholeness or the indivisibility that she put out there gives rise to a multitude of ways to reimagine what it means to, in fact, be free. And for that, I am thankful.
In 1931, Pauli Murray created a series of selfies in an album that she called The Life and Times of an American Called Pauli Murray. She had already let go of her given name, Anna Pauline, and she created this picture, the imp. Now, when I think about an imp, the imps are small and mischievous. Pauli was my size and very wiry. Imps like to create mayhem. Pauli liked to call herself America's problem child. But imps were also tricksters and people who wanted to disrupt systems of power. This is the kind of imp that I think Pauli Murray was. So this talk is called The Imp's Guide to Social Justice, and I have 4 insights to offer you. But first, where did this imp come from? How did the imp nature come out in Pauli Murray? I would argue it was these people who helped develop the imp's nature. On my right, your left, are Robert George and Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald, Pauli Murray's grandparents. These are the people that she grew up with. As a very young child, she lost her mother, who had had 6 children very quickly, and she came to live with this family. Robert George Fitzgerald was a Union he served in both the Union Army and the Union Navy, and then returned to North Carolina to become an educator in what he called the Second Great War, the war against ignorance. He left his family, his mother, who was white, his father, who at that time would have been categorized as mulatto, and convinced them all to move with him a few years later to North Carolina. His oldest daughter, Mary Pauline, for whom Pauli was named, was also an educator. She followed her father to school every day and was a very bright child and very tall. So when she needed to start helping the family support itself as a 14-year-old, she went and took the test in Raleigh and became a teacher. Pauline was 40 years old when young Pauli arrived in Durham. She was a precocious child. She was a very smart child, and she followed Aunt Pauline to school every day and sat in the back of the classroom. But these people imbued Pauli with this idea that she had a responsibility to keep their work going, to keep working for justice, to keep advancing the race, to keep promoting education. Now, Aunt Pauline, and you can tell from this picture, and we've actually met people who were in her classroom, was not always easy or loose. She was a little strict. But what was interesting about her is that as she raised Pauli, she also wanted her to understand that she needed to be responsible for her own choices. So on the one hand, she would be strict, and on the other hand, she would be very permissive. So there's a great story when Pauli was a child. Aunt Pauline allowed her to pick out her own winter coat and hat. And she chose a chinchilla coat with a red flannel lining and this funny little Tyrolean hat. Well, you can imagine that some of her schoolmates thought this was quite hysterical. And Aunt Pauline would let her wear this outfit everywhere except church. She had to let go of the hat to go to church. But this helped Pauli to think about who she wanted to be and what was important. And it encouraged her to think that who she was and her own experience was really important. And so I want to share that first lesson. Trust your own feelings and experience. Pauli drew upon her experience in so many ways, and it was the root of what made her brilliant theories sort of emerge and allowed her to share those. You know, she graduated at the top of her class, except that she didn't get the greatest grades in conduct in high school. But she went on to college in New York City and graduated into the middle of the Depression. She didn't want to go back home. She had no interest in returning to the South and Jim Crow laws, and she really was ambitious. but it was a very tough time. Yet she drew upon that inner strength that she gained from those grandparents and her aunt in order to make her way. She worked in many different jobs. She was sometimes didn't have enough food. She became even smaller than she was before. But she started to think about who she was and what she wanted to be. She also found at this time she was attracted to other women. And she started making friendships and relationships. She jumps boxcars and rides across the country dressed as a boy. She writes about these experiences. She's encouraged to really start to blossom in who she is. I think it's this experience, this combination, that helps us understand where Jane Crow comes from. That helps us understand this notion of her he-she personality. So she's trying to find words to describe what is important to her, but she's also realizing that this lived experience outside the norm. She's not following the rules. She's not doing things that girls do. She wants to do things that men do. She wants to have a career of importance. She wants to be able to speak out. She wants to stand on her own 2 feet, just as the women in her life have done before. And yet, this is not what is encouraged. And she actually writes about this in a letter to her aunt in 1943, where she understands the vulnerability of this. She says, "I don't know whether I'm right or whether society or some medical authority is right. I only know how I feel and what makes me happy. This conflict rises up to knock me down at every apex I reach in my career. And because the laws of society don't protect me, I'm exposed to any enemy or person who may or may not want to hurt me." So often, she gets a choice. So many times I think about Pauli Murray's life. She just could have made an easy choice. Oh, I'll just be this. I'll stop here. I won't push this farther. I'll settle for this. I'll do what's being told to me. And she doesn't do that. She just keeps pushing. Now, how does she do this? I think this leads me to the next idea, which is words. Words are her weapons. Words are the things that she uses in her poetry, in her sermons, in her millions, I think, if we counted them all, letters that she sent off to various people that she wanted to be in conversation with, to news media. In 1938, she applies to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to go to graduate school. She's the unmarried daughter of aging women. They want her to move back to North Carolina to help them. She's already fought for the rights of a sharecropper who was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. She's already traveled the country, having to take the same stage as Thurgood Marshall. She's learned a little bit about who she is. She wants to be in this conversation. She thinks, well, I'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'll come home, I'll take care of the aunts, and I'll go to college, go to graduate school. She wants to go to a sociology program where they're talking about race and race relations. She's quickly denied admission because of her race. University of North Carolina does not admit its first African-American graduate students until 1952. But instead of just sitting around, she launches her own media campaign. Franklin Roosevelt had been speaking at the University of North Carolina in the weeks before this happened, and she's incensed because he calls the university progressive. She's like, progressive? How could you call yourself progressive when you want to talk about race, but you don't want to allow African Americans in the room in the conversation? So she writes these letters. She writes to Franklin Roosevelt, and she was kind of well known as a carbon copier. And she sent a carbon copy of that letter to Eleanor Roosevelt and started a friendship with her which would last throughout their lives. So this is an amazing person who really understands the power of the word, and she uses it to her greatest advantage. And I think we see this. There are more than 2,500 folders of material of Pauli Murray's in the Schlesinger Archive for Women's History at Radcliffe, Harvard University. So she saves everything. She understands the power and importance of those words. And it's today that we can hear it in her sermons, in those letters, and think about how this invites us to do the same, to use the power of words to express and name. And I think this is one of the most important things, where she doesn't find words that express who she is, what her experience is, she just creates them. So we're not limited by what's out there. We can create new ideas by using words. This isn't an easy journey. More than once, Pauli Murray finds herself under psychiatric care. When she's challenging her gender identity, she's also doing research. She's learning about medical research in Europe that's focused on hormone therapies. She goes to her doctors with long lists of questions about her condition. Why is this like this? What can be done? How can I make sense of my experience? My urgings to want to be the person I want to be in the world, my attraction to very feminine women, my interest in moving this forward. How do I mesh those things together? These are very difficult times. The doors keep closing in her face, and yet she continues to try to find the strength to persist. But there are very difficult times. And so that idea of being both courageous but accepting that that's going to be a difficult road, that that's going to also mean accepting your humanness, your vulnerability, the difficult times that you might be facing. And I think that's also a really important idea for us moving forward. What does it mean? And I love the idea of courage as really being our ability to tell our own story, to be fully in our uniqueness in the world, and our ability to hold what can happen when we actually show up. As we've heard in previous talks, this idea of being able to bring your full self. Pauli's vision for creating a world in which she could fully show up. These, I think, are the most important things, but the journey is very difficult. It's full of highs and lows. And finally, we're not going to heal until we face the truth. Pauli talks about this in terms of politics. She says, don't ask me to be a woman one day, a Negro one day, a worker the next. I have to find the unifying principles under which I can show up. But we're not going to be able to do this until we face the truth. For her, she says, this is good politics. For me, this is the price of survival. So I think that this idea about who Pauli Murray is, about where she's come from in Durham, North Carolina, about what this vision might look like, is really calling us to think about the words of her poem, the poem that's inspired today's talk. This idea that in becoming this new American, in embracing these opportunities, that we're not, she talks about we all feel divided. We're the children of this, we're the children of this, we're pulled in this direction, we're pulled in that direction. But she is interested in embracing our relatedness. In an interview she did with Charles Corral right at the Chapel of the Cross, she said, that's the interesting thing about the South. Black, white, and red are related by common history, common culture, common traditions. When are we going to admit that we're all related? We share common blood. She actually believed that you could line everybody up and we would all find that relatedness to one another. And she said, we're not going to do that until we face the truth. So when we think about that, when we think about that truth in the future, when we think about the work that we want to do at the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, in Pauli Murray's childhood home, the home that Robert and Cornelia built in the 1890s, the home that is part of the West End neighborhood that nurtured Pauli and thought she was a little strange. She had a paper route. She was from the other side of town. The larger African American community was in Hayti on the other side of town. She distinguished herself publishing her first pieces in the local African American paper. But she was a unique and wonderful person that was brought forth from that community. I think that we hope that in the future, the work that we will do at the center will do is exactly what Lisa was talking about. Think about how we start from wholeness, not how we start from difference. Many of the logics that we use to solve problems in mathematics, in science, in philosophy, invite us to think about how to divide those things into pieces. Understand the pieces and then put them together as a whole. What I think we're suggesting is that we start at the place of wholeness. We think about what assets do we bring to that process? What muscles do we need to flex and practice in order to, because just like Jane Crow, just like the notion of he-she personality, this is a logic that's sort of turning itself on its head. This is a different way of seeing. So we hope in the future that we will be able to continue in Pauli's spirit, that we will be able to nurture the next generation, what we call future firebrands, that we will encourage other people to speak their outrage, as Pauli Murray does so eloquently in all of her writings, and that we will become a place where folks can come and celebrate her sainthood, her work as an attorney, her work as a poet, her work as a feminist, her work, all of these things put together. This is the kind of work that we hope to do here in Durham, so that as we think about her lessons for justice and equality, how can they take a foothold in the 21st century, and how can we, in Pauli's words, help human dignity take root and grow? Thank you very much.
When I was training to be a forensic psychologist, I once had to go to the local detention center to evaluate a young African-American girl. Let's call her Leisha. And when I received Leisha's file, I also received detailed warnings and admonitions about safety and what to expect. At 16 years old, Leisha had already amassed a storied tenure in the juvenile justice system, one that included charges of assault with a dangerous weapon. She was described as aggressive, as impulsive, and in the 2 days before I received her file, she had already dispatched 2 other evaluators with a hurl of expletives. So here I was, the 3rd person being sent in to assess Leisha, and I go in and I sit down and I'm bracing myself, but this Leisha that I meet is nothing like the Leisha that I heard about. This Leisha is polite, she's appropriate, she answers my questions appropriately. The only thing of note really is that when I show her one of those ink blot cards, you know, the one I show the picture, you tell me what you see, she gets up, she starts to scream, saying that they remind her of the nightmares she has at night. When we're wrapping up the evaluation, Leisha spontaneously says to me, you know what, I like you. The other 2 who came in, they just came in with their questions and their papers. I didn't know them. But you came in and you said good morning and you asked me how I was. You treated me like a human being. And even though I didn't know it then, Leisha was my first lesson in therapeutic jurisprudence. This idea that the law and its actors, of which I was one in that capacity, have a therapeutic and a counter-therapeutic impact on the people that we serve. Now, I'm not talking about compassion or empathy. I'm referring to an intentional consideration of the ways that whether we intend them to or not, the decisions that we make as agents of the legal system can have visible but also hidden effects on the mental and physical health of the people that we serve. When we talk about therapeutic jurisprudence, we're referring to the ways in which mental health and psychological applications inform and shape legal processes, whether positively or negatively. And from an aspirational standpoint, psychology and the law operate symbiotically to produce just, relevant, and impactful consequences. So by this time, you might be asking, what does this have to do with Pauli Murray? Well, everything. Pauli Murray was once an African-American girl who, like Leisha, contended with a host of adversities. Unlike Leisha, however, Murray was able to harness her resilience and her formidable intellect to become a person who is now an example of what it means to live a self-actualized life as a person in these United States. I think that long before David Wexler coined the term, Pauli Murray actively embodied and implicitly understood therapeutic jurisprudence. It's almost as if her vision of the law and justice actively incorporated psychology's most cardinal ethical principle: do no harm. We elevate Murray for the ways that her life was a reiterative assertion to self-actualization as a right. But at the same time, let's get something clear. She also understood that self-actualization and the barriers to its attainment were inextricably tied to a legal infrastructure that sustained the well-being of minoritized groups, that considered the consequences of legal procedures and enactments, and that ultimately did no harm. So with this in mind, I'd like to consider the ways that, especially now, Pauli Murray's life represents a veritable signpost at the ways that we can accomplish therapeutic jurisprudence in the contemporary context. Throughout her life, Pauli Murray was very invested in the tentacular scope and reach of Jane Crow laws. I'd like to think that if she were here with us today, she would be outraged at the ways that African American girls are disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system, girls like Leisha. At a time where the total number of youth who are detained in secure settings are plummeting, the rate for African American girls specifically is skyrocketing. Such as I think her legacy offers valuable insights and lessons for how we might address these trends. I'd like to offer 3 lessons now. First one, see the complexity of Black girls' lives. I'd like to think that Pauli Murray would be invested in the therapeutic jurisprudence mandate today because of the ways that mental health challenges pervaded her own life and that of some of her family members. In fact, some of the challenges that Murray faced in her formative years are the precise fodder that land African American girls in the juvenile justice system today. Issues such as complex trauma, displacement, family mental illness, and identity. At 3 years old, Murray lost her mother, and several years later, her father when he was sent to a mental health facility. He was murdered there subsequently by a white prison guard. Nothing about this sounds familiar, right? As she got older, Murray repeatedly and often single-handedly took on racist and sexist structures that were determined to erase the full scope of her personhood and her brilliance. As a visibly gender nonconforming person, for the vast majority of her life, Murray was determined to live an authentic life that was congruent with her own experience of herself. However, when she made formal attempts to formally embody that congruence, the fields of psychiatry and psychology of the day labeled her very way of being as endemically problematic, as disordered. It's no surprise then that on the road to self-actualization, Pauli Murray found herself in a mental health facility at least 3 times. But I want to be clear that this was a function of her recurrent engagement with a socially pathogenic environment. We often praise Murray for her exceptionalism, but the reality is that the challenges that she faced are by no means exceptional. They were all too common then and all too common now. As persons who are inspired by her legacy, we sometimes succumb to the temptation to kind of hide this less palatable piece. Because for some of us, mental health challenges might fly in the face of or potentially even undermine this legend of exceptionalism that Murray represented. but not including the psychological component of Murray's narrative, obscures and discredits the full breadth of who she was and what it took to accomplish what it is she accomplished. It also obscures the reality that for African American girls like Leisha, their mental health challenges are a natural, inevitable, and adaptable response to a disordered environment. I think our desire sometimes to sideline this aspect of Pauli Murray's history also does us a disservice, because it then justifies or legitimizes the tendency to believe that for African American girls, resilience is an inexhaustible resource. When it appears to run out, when they run away from abusive or sexually abusive or physically abusive caregivers, when they are truant from school because of targeting because of a gender nonconforming identity, when we demand that they personify some emblem of Black feminine strength, and when they do, we turn around and punish them with correctional measures. In the absence of Murray's brand of resilience, in the absence of supportive family systems, in the absence of a judicial system that can distinguish between legitimate acts of delinquency and adolescent or developmental growth edges, African American girls are more likely to find themselves in carceral systems. And with this in mind, I'd like to come to lesson 2. And that is a therapeutic jurisprudence mandate calls for a more intentional alliance between the law and psychology. Being ultimately interested in different components of behavior, the law and psychology are inextricably allied. Even though we operate in an adversarial system, psychology and the law need not be adversaries. Because therapeutic jurisprudence is interested in the ways that insights from mental health and psychology shape the law, we must take into account the pervasiveness of mental health challenges for justice involved youth of color. We must also keep sight of the fact that of the mental health impact of judicial determinations on the mental health of African American girls and their developmental trajectory. We now live in a time where African American girls are the fastest growing population in the juvenile justice system. Compared with other groups, they receive the harshest sentences, and they're most likely to have delinquency ascribed to their responses to trauma or to other personal characteristics. Just want to go back to Leisha really quickly. You'll remember I mentioned she had a charge of assault with a dangerous weapon. Any interest in hearing what her weapon was? Her foot. Her foot. In the context of a domestic violence altercation when she was 13 years old, Leisha defended herself and kicked her aggressor once, and this resulted in this charge. Now, I am not saying that Leisha should be applauded or not subject to some sort of remediation or intervention, but I am saying that fidelity to therapeutic jurisprudence can help enhance the discretion that determines what might constitute a violent offense. So psychology stands to be an important ally in uncovering the impact of these dynamics in the legal system, in the ways that it can study the attitudes of legal actors that enable them to meet minor infractions with aggressive policing, in the ways it can explore how stereotypes haphazardly applied to girls. Paradoxically, girls begin to embody those very stereotypes, and how the stigma of juvenile justice involvement can direct their paths into adulthood. These are intersectional problems that require intersectional solutions, and an allyship between the law and psychology might be fundamental to answering some of these questions. And this leads me to my third lesson. There we go. A therapeutic jurisprudence mandate privileges intersectionality. It specifically recognizes the intersectional relationships among systemic issues, mental health, and girls' placement in the juvenile justice system. The genius of Murray's life was her implicit understanding of the ways that the multiple embodiment of various characteristics or identities expose African Americans to specific oppressions that are inextricably tied to those identities. Before we were talking about intersectionality, Pauli Murray was talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality also alerts us to the ways that US society is a minefield of systemic, interpersonal, and internalized oppressions, what Patricia Hill Collins refers to as a matrix of oppressions. This matrix has compounding traumatic effects on the identities and behaviors and the overall mental health of African American girls. A therapeutic jurisprudence mandate, therefore, even as it upholds the law, more ardently considers the impact of these invisible societal and legal processes that define the carceral experiences of Black girls. Pauli Murray envisioned a new American in which the law and justice enhanced the life chances of African American people, whether as a citizen who challenged the color line on a Virginia bus, or as a legal scholar who ultimately crafted the strategies of the civil rights and women's movements. Murray upheld the mandate for therapeutic jurisprudence by interrogating, challenging, and dismantling those systems that undermine this vision of justice. She was intimately aware of the psychological costs of abandoning this ideal. Let's sing her song of a new American by ensuring that more girls with the beginnings of Alicia ends up with the ends of a Murray. Thank you.
Queer, Black, female, trans, rich, bougie, poor, low income, unrefined. These are just some of the labels that we and others impose upon ourselves. Yet we know the truth of our lived experiences is that our lives transcend these limited labels and categorizations. What Dr. Murray's life exemplifies is that our identities and our intersecting identities are so much more complex than these narrow labels that limit, erase, and deny the wholeness of who we are. And in fact, not just the complexity of our identities, our differences, but the universality. That's what her life instructs us. Her life also instructs us that we have to abandon these limited labels. We can't continue to stick to these categorizations that keep us safe or divide us if we ever hope to truly move forward and achieve social justice. Now, I found a great example of this because oftentimes we talk about this, discarding these labels, moving beyond categorizations, but how do we do this? So there was a video, it's actually going viral right now, of a Canadian politician. He also happens to be Sikh, and he wears a turban and he has a beard, and he was at a constituent event. He's running to head up one of the major political parties in Canada. So he's at this constituent event, and this woman jumps in his face. She's screaming at him, yelling at him, calling him a terrorist and a Muslim, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And you should really see this video because the way he responds to her is amazing, right? He's calm, he keeps saying, and to her and to his constituents, we're gathered here today in love and courage, and just very calmly responding to her. But what's interesting is what he doesn't do. He doesn't correct her. He doesn't say, ma'am, actually, I'm Sikh, I'm not Muslim. He doesn't do that. And even his staff advised him to do that. And later he explained why. To correct her, misidentification of his religion would have been in some ways to condone her bigotry and hatred of Muslims. And he said, my response to Islamophobia is never, I'm not a Muslim. It's always, hatred is wrong. See, when we dissociate, when we say, oh, not me, we fail to expose and condemn the underlying hatred. That's the problem, is the hatred itself. Because see, today, hatred might be targeted towards Muslims or undocumented individuals or LGBTQ individuals. But tomorrow, it could be women, it could be Catholics, it could be black people. And let's be honest, it's black people a lot, right? So we do have to admit that, right? But this interaction and this politician's really astute response exemplifies what Murray's legacy instructs us. We can't just work for justice and equality for only a few of us who fit certain labels. We can't seek to dissociate ourselves from those labels that might be unpopular at a particular moment. See, when we do that, we fail to condemn the bigotry and hatred that underlies it, that underlies discrimination. We don't identify the discrimination itself. That's the problem. And the ironic thing about discrimination is it doesn't really discriminate, right? We're all subject to some kind of discrimination. We're all subject to the dehumanization and humiliation of discrimination. So this politician actually had it right. But you know what? Honestly, we've been playing respectability politics for too long. We've been dissociating for too long. The sin of our social justice movement is we have been so busy playing politics and respectability politics and being politically correct that we have let folks be marginalized from our movement. So here we are. Here we are today. The public discourse is rife with racism, hatred, bigotry. The rhetoric is horrendous. We have a bigot in the highest office in this land, following the successful tenure of our nation's first black president. And here we are. And you know what? It happened on our watch. And it happened on our watch because it was happening to some of us. It wasn't happening to all of us. So we are, at least in part, are responsible for how and why we've ended up here. And the election laid bare the racism, the classism, the dissension that's really been present in our nation for decades. And even in our social justice movements, again, we have been so busy playing respectability politics that we've actually failed to address how we're erasing the identities and the issues that are so central to other people. And I actually experienced this. I came to DC a little over 12 years ago to do a fellowship called the Women's Law and Public Policy Fellowship Program. It's a post-grad legal fellowship. And I was placed as a fellow with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. How many of you can guess the organization didn't see me before the fellowship, right? But actually they did, but you know. It was a great opportunity, and I actually encourage everyone who's working on social justice issues, try working for issues that don't directly affect you. You'll learn a lot about what it means to be a true ally, what it means to check your own privilege. And so I would go as a fellow to different coalition meetings. And my work was focused on reproductive rights and health. And so I would go to the quote unquote mainstream reproductive rights meetings, mainstream meaning white. And I would go to these coalition meetings and they would talk about all these issues, and the issues that were important to Asian American and Pacific Islander women never came up. And so I would always have to raise my hand or interject or say something. And so I experienced what it felt like to actually be ignored and erased. And the more I learned about the reproductive rights movement, the more research, the more that I dug down, I saw a pattern over time. And I looked back, and we see as early as only 3 years after Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion, became the law of the land, Congress passed what's called the Hyde Amendment. It prohibits women enrolled in Medicaid from using that coverage for abortions. And then we see the 5-year bar on immigrants accessing means-tested benefits so they don't, become dependent on the system. And there was this chipping away over time at the rights of those folks who were considered to be at the margins of the mainstream movement. So poor women, immigrant women, LGBTQ individuals, trans men, it happened over time. And then here we are. And today we face daily assaults. I still work on reproductive rights and health with the National Women's Law Center. And we're expecting any day now for the administration to actually take action to take away no-cost birth control, contraception and counseling that was secured in the Affordable Care Act, to allow virtually anyone, an employer, a school, to deny coverage for contraception. We have a president who has pledged to appoint a Supreme Court justice who actually has appointed one already, who is hostile to choice and who is committed to overturning Roe versus Wade. And here we are. And it happened on our watch because, again, it was just happening to some of us, but not to all of us. And so Murray was right. We have to pay attention because this is how we've ended up here. So long as it was only undocumented women, so long as it was only women of color, it wasn't everyone's fight, right? But again, that's how we've arrived at where we are today. But see, the truth of the matter is, it was our fight when undocumented women were losing access to the care that they needed. It was our fight when Puerto Rican women in New York or Los Angeles were being sterilized. It was our fight way back when black women's wounds were being commoditized during slavery. It's always been our fight. It's our fight when incarcerated women are shackled during labor. It's our fight when trans men are denied the health services that they need. It is our fight. That's what we must acknowledge. But see, our own allegiance to our labels and our divisions and our silos and our work has led us here. See, Murray in her time highlighted the sexism, the homophobia, even the elitism that was rampant in the civil rights movement. And she paid a price for that. She criticized the organizers of the March on Washington, particularly A. Philip Randolph, who was this really revered civil rights leader, for not allowing women to speak at the March on Washington. And finally, after a lot of criticism, they relented and they said, okay, Dorothy Height can speak. And then a couple of women later chose to just spontaneously speak during the march. But Murray paid a price for that. She paid a price for speaking out. There's a reason why her name is not as well known or widespread as a Thurgood Marshall or Martin Luther King. She was just as accomplished. So we have to examine the price that we end up having to pay for speaking out and speaking against these categorizations and these labels. And we also have to be honest. We have to examine ourselves. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, it was mentioned earlier that Murray wanted to integrate the University of North Carolina. Thurgood Marshall didn't take on her case. We have to be honest about why, right? Her queerness, her inability to be complacent, her struggles with mental illness didn't make her an ideal client in respectability politics speak, right? Later, I would actually go on to work for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and I worked on education policy. And LDF actually separated from the NAACP, even though it's still in the name, which is so confusing. But it's a separate legal entity co-founded by Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston. And I learned more about a lot of the legal strategies that were behind some of the cases. And if you look at the cases that were consolidated that became Brown versus Board of Education, the plaintiffs in the other cases were women. They were mothers. Oliver Brown was a sole male. He was a reverend. He was an upstanding member of his community. And so Marshall and the other litigators made a calculated decision. This man, as our lead plaintiff, might fare better with the then all-male U.S. Supreme Court than if we used a woman. They made a calculated decision. Maybe they were right. But we have to really count the cost when we make these kind of decisions. We have to be honest with ourselves. Respectability politics, particularly over time, it's come at a price. It's cost us. Murray's legacy counsels that we have to look inward. We have to acknowledge the internalized hatred and the patriarchy that still exist and pervade our social justice movements. We have to acknowledge that. We have to expose the hypocrisy and the contradictions within our own movements. So how do we do this? Because this sounds so idealistic and overwhelming, right? Well, one way is we can do what the Canadian politician did. We can not dissociate. We can instead focus on the actual underlying hate, which is the problem. We can not worry about what label is being ascribed to us or not. But we also have to be careful when we work on not dissociating that we don't try to stand in the shoes of other folks, right? Even though I was working during my fellowship on issues impacting API women, I was always careful to not claim to speak for API women. We can't claim to speak for other people, and we have to check our own privilege. The second way we can address this is by embarking on relationships with folks who are not exactly like us. Murray did this in a relationship with then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Dr. Patricia Bell Scott details this in her book, The Firebrand and the First Lady. You couldn't have two people who are more different. You have this socialite First Lady, you have this outspoken civil rights champion, yet they forged this friendship, and Murray showed up honestly to this friendship. And the third thing is also what Murray did, and she did it in her relationship and friendship with the First Lady. We have to stop having polite conversations. If you look at some of the letters that Murray wrote to the First Lady in Professor Scott's book, she wasn't always polite. She was direct. We have to speak the truth even if it's painful and even if folks don't want to hear it. That's the only way that we're going to heal and move forward. We have to abandon these respectability politics. Dr. Murray also encourages us to embrace our commonalities, our contradictions, our limitations, our ignorance. We have to step into this, and we have to instead embrace, as many folks have mentioned in talks earlier today, our shared humanity, the commonalities that we share, the rights that are intrinsic in our humanness, not based on our citizenship or our income or our status, but based on our shared humanity. This morning, the Reverend quoted from Murray's autobiography, Song in a Weary Throat. And I'm going to quote it again because I really do think it's powerful, and it really exemplifies Murray's life and legacy. When she became an Episcopalian priest, she said, "Now I am empowered to administer the sacrament of the one who knows no north or south, black or white, male or female, only the spirit of love and reconciliation moving us towards the common goal of our shared humanity and our human wholeness. Only by the brave act of showing up as our full selves, as Murray so fearlessly did, despite the backlash, can we truly hope to move forward in our social justice movement and embrace each other and achieve true justice and equality. Thank you.